very important to understand the financial crisis that hit the United States and the world in late 2008, partly because it was important to all of our economic and personal lives, but partly also because it will shape our political dialogue for years or decades, just the way the Great Depression did. So it's important to know what actually happened, and I'm sure all of you know that there have been a lot of journalists and pundits and public figures blaming capitalism, claiming that the credit crisis means the end of libertarianism or the end of American capitalism or whatever. And that's why I think it is important to place the blame accurately. Now, we haven't all agreed yet on what happened in the Great Depression, so we're probably not likely to agree by the end of this evening or the end of this year what happened in the Great Recession or the Great Crisis or whatever, but it's important to talk about it. I thought that the late Christopher Hitchens put it rather pithily when he wrote, "There are many causes of the subprime and derivative horror show that has destroyed our trust in the idea of credit, but one way of defining it would be to say that everybody was promised everything, and almost everybody fell for the populist bait." And I think that's a good line. I've used it several times. Everybody was promised everything, and that included cheap money, easy lending, rising home prices, rising portfolios, all beneficently given to us. But that's enough from me about the financial crisis, because we do have an expert here to discuss that. So let me just say that I'm pleased to welcome only the second president in the 36-year history of the Cato Institute, John Allison. Many of you know John Allison spent almost 40 years at BB&T. During his 20 years as chairman and CEO, he took it from an organization with $4.5 billion in assets to $152 billion. Made it one of the 10 largest financial institutions in the country, and one that over the past decade, I think, was often praised. John was named one of the top 100 worldwide CEOs by Harvard Business Review, but also sometimes criticized for not getting on this train of cheap money and subprime and so on. And John and the other leaders of BB&T were criticized. You're not growing as fast as the other banks. Why don't you get involved in these fields? In the long run, I think he feels pretty good about the decisions he made during that period. I think that he might have first come to broad public attention beyond the banking and finance community when many of us in this room remember reading that BB&T announced it would no longer lend to projects supported by eminent domain. And that's when we first said, well, that's very interesting. That's a banker who's different from the standard bankers. He did retire about 4 years ago. He had a very busy retirement. He was a distinguished professor at the Wake Forest University School of Business. He also served on the board there and at a couple of other universities. He did a lot of speaking. He obviously wrote a book. He worked with the BB&T Foundation to help put free market ideas in a lot of universities. There are a lot of BB&T professors around, and we're very fortunate that he stepped in after this busy, not quite retirement, to take a job as the second president of the Cato Institute. Please welcome John Allison.
Thanks, David, and good evening. Thank all of you for being here this evening. The thought I'd like to start with is to reflect on why I really wrote this book. And I guess in one way, one of the primary reasons I thought it would be interesting to have a book by somebody that actually knew what happened. I thought that would be very interesting. Because I hear all this stuff on TV, these people that are so certain that they don't have any idea what they're talking about. Secondly, I wanted to get rid of a myth. And the myth is that the financial crisis was caused by the deregulation of the financial services industry and by greed on Wall Street. Well, first place, the financial services industry was not deregulated. We had a massive increase in regulations during the Bush administration. 3 major new laws: the Privacy Act, the Patriot Act, Sarbanes-Oxley. We were misregulated, not deregulated. And then secondly, while in my 40-year career, there's always been plenty of greed on Wall Street and plenty of fear. There's not one shred of evidence there was suddenly a greed plague that swept across Wall Street. In terms of greed on Wall Street. In fact, in my book, I have 6 basic themes. The first theme is that the primary cause of the financial crisis was government policy. We don't live in a free market in the United States. We live in a very mixed economy. The mixture varies by industry. Technology is the least regulated industry and has done very well. Financial services is the most regulated industry in the world. It's not surprising that our big problems have come out of the most regulated industry. Secondly, government policy created a massive misinvestment, what's called a bubble. They got focused primarily in residential real estate. That bubble burst, destroying millions of jobs and trillions of dollars of wealth. Thirdly, a number of large financial institutions, so-called Wall Street, made a number of major mistakes. If I had been in charge, I'd have let those institutions fail. However, those mistakes were secondary, and they were all incented by government policy. Fourthly, and most unfortunately, almost everything we've done since the financial crisis started, even things that may have had a short-term benefit, will reduce, and in many cases, materially reduce our standard of living in the long term. Fifth, and most important, the real cause of the financial crisis is not economic, it's philosophical. And the real cure is philosophical. And finally, if we don't change direction soon, we face some really severe economic consequences in the long term for our children and our grandchildren. Okay, what happened? We built and invested at least $3 trillion, too much in residential real estate. Probably as much as $8 trillion, depends on how you measure it. But at least $3 trillion. Built too many houses, too big of houses, built houses in the wrong place. We should have been investing in technology, manufacturing capacity, agriculture, education. We should have saved more and spent less. We should have borrowed less from foreigners. Overinvestment in real estate is particularly destructive. Houses are consumption. Now, people think of a house as a personal investment, but from an economic perspective, we consume a house just like we consume an automobile. So we overconsumed. We ate our seed corn as an agricultural example. If you look at that misinvestment, what happened in that process is we taught millions of people how to do the wrong things. This bubble, it went exponential, but it started back in the early 1990s. So we taught millions of people how to build houses, to be residential lenders, to be real estate attorneys, and those millions of people are having to learn new jobs, which is one reason that unemployment has remained fairly stuck. The other thing we did is manufacturing jobs and construction jobs are competitive. If you artificially drive up construction wages, you artificially drive up manufacturing wages, and in that process we send a lot of manufacturing jobs overseas that we cannot get back. How did we make a mistake of that magnitude? How did we make a $3 to $8 trillion error? It's interesting that markets are constantly making mistakes and are constantly learning. They're a constant correction process. However, markets never make mistakes of that magnitude. The two primary culprits that created this massive misinvestment were the Federal Reserve and government housing policy, specifically Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the giant government-sponsored enterprises that would never exist in a free market. In fact, the primary cause is the Federal Reserve, and in my 40-year career, every economic misinvestment, the roots have always been in errors made by the Federal Reserve. Now, this is an interesting thing. Any of you that have studied economics or studied finance know this, but you might not think about what the implications are. In 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the monetary system in the United States was nationalized. There is no private monetary system. The government owns the monetary system. If something goes wrong in the monetary system, by definition, it's a government policy problem. If interstate highway bridges were falling down, people would say, wow, government owns the bridges, they're falling down. It's a government's problem. The government owns the monetary bridges in the United States. The Federal Reserve was created in theory to reduce volatility in the economy. In practice, what they do is reduce volatility in the short term and create bigger problems in the long term. Why is that? Free markets are constant experiments. We're constantly learning. For every Google, there's a thousand failed Googles. And part of the experimental process is letting companies fail. New companies are created, old companies are going out of business, and that releases their resources, their human and physical capital, to produce other goods and services. When you stop that downside process, you just make problems bigger in the future. It'd be analogous to not disciplining a 13-year-old child, and then when they get 16, you're going to be real unhappy with their behavior. In addition, there were some very specific concrete problems that set up the mess that we're still struggling with today. In the early 2000s, Alan Greenspan, who had been the longtime head of the Federal Reserve, wanted to go out a hero. He was getting ready to retire, and he wanted to go out a hero. We were having a minor correction that we really needed to have, but he didn't want that to happen, so he printed a bunch of money, creating what's called negative real interest rates. That means that you could borrow at less than the inflation rate, and you could borrow at a lot less than the appreciation rate in real estate, which incented a massive level of borrowing. In a certain mathematical sense, the only way that there would be money to create a bubble is if the Fed provided it. Where did the money come from otherwise? The Fed created a huge monetary incentive for people to overconsume. Because when the Federal Reserve is printing money and we don't exactly realize what's going on, we tend to think we're wealthier than we are. And that's exactly what happened. People overconsumed. And the overconsumption got largely focused in the housing market because of government housing policy. Now this actually goes back a long time. It goes back really to the 1930s, but it particularly got accelerated in the 1970s. And the theory in government housing policy is to raise home ownership above what's called the natural market rate, because owning a home is a good thing. Well, it's very interesting, owning a home is a good thing, but there's no evidence that owning a home per se changes human behavior. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The set of characteristics that enable you to own a home, self-discipline, being willing to self-control of what makes home ownership a good thing. And certainly incenting people to buy homes that they can't afford, young people to buy homes before they've saved enough is not a good thing. We've got the negative consequences of that. In the early 1970s, we had things called the Community Reinvestment Act, which basically forced banks to get into the low-income lending business, and banks are not designed to do low-income loans because we're lending other people's money through deposits. But the really big event that eventually spiraled out of control happened in September of 1999, I remember well, where Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, announced a goal for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, these two giant government-sponsored enterprises, to have half their loan portfolio in affordable housing, i.e. subprime loans. And interestingly enough, a number of economists, including an article that's actually written in the New York Times of all places, said, wow, this is risky. The legitimate subprime market is not that big. And if Freddie and Fannie try to reach this goal, they could get in financial trouble, and they are so big they could take out the U.S. financial system, and it could happen in 10 years. And 9 years later, it happened. Freddie and Fannie sound like an abstract, but today, if you go down to a local bank or anywhere to get a home mortgage, there's a 90% probability that either Freddie, Fannie, or what's called the FHA, their sister institution, will buy that mortgage. They absolutely dominate the home finance business in the United States, and they've done that for a number of years since the demise of the S&L industry. They make the rules in the industry. They establish the standards. When Freddie and Fannie failed, they had $5 trillion in liabilities that you now inherited as a taxpayer. Congratulations. And they had $2 trillion in subprime mortgages. They were the absolute dominant player in the subprime mortgage business. Politics played a huge role in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. I was personally on a committee of the Financial Services Roundtable for 9 years trying to do something about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. We were running the numbers, and it was mathematically certain they were going broke. Anybody in this room, I'd say a 15-year-old, could look at the numbers and say, wow, these guys are going broke. We met with Congress on numerous occasions with people like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, who are very interesting people. I call Barney Frank the evil one because he's actually smart. But he absolutely refused to listen. And why did he refuse to listen? First, he had what I call a religious belief in affordable housing. It was just a good thing. And secondly, Freddie and Fannie were huge political contributors. They were the single biggest contributor to the Democratic Party, and they were one of the biggest contributors to the Republican Party. So they just watched Freddie and Fannie go. It's very interesting. While there's lots of complexities in regards to the financial crisis, fundamentally, we had the massive misinvestment, waste of capital, waste of human resources, driven by the Federal Reserve into the housing market by the affordable housing policies, the subprime lending policies of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And when somebody like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae has that big a market share, anybody that's ever been in business, you can't not do what they do. They brought down the standards in the whole industry. Now, there are lots of important other considerations that I try to cover in my book that I won't try to cover tonight just simply for time purposes. Things like the role of fair value accounting, a lot of misconception of what the derivatives market really was, lack of understanding of the derivatives markets, way over emphasis on the so-called contagion risk, which was grossly exaggerated. I try to cover that all in the book. Be glad to answer questions about it. Also, I try to propose some economic cures that I believe this group would probably agree with. But what I really want to talk about is as interesting and as important the economics are, the real cause of the financial crisis and the real cure is philosophical. The real cause of the financial crisis was a combination of altruism and pragmatism. Altruism is not benevolence. It's really otherism. It says that everybody else is important but you. And by status, altruism becomes that the community matters and the individual is irrelevant. The individual simply doesn't matter. Everybody has a right to a nice house, provided by who? Everybody has a right to free medical care, provided by who? And my right to free medical care is my right to force a doctor to provide me with that medical care or force somebody else to pay that doctor. That is exactly the opposite of the American concept of rights. In the American concept of rights, you have the right to what you produce, what you create. You don't have the right to what somebody else produces and what somebody else creates. In business, we play a little lip service to altruism. We run ads acting like we're altruistic. But businesses in a globally competitive economy cannot be altruistic. They will be out of business really quick. So the backup philosophy for most business people is pragmatism. And the rule in pragmatism is to do what works. However, unfortunately, lots of things work in the short term that are incredibly destructive in the long term. Subprime mortgages worked for years. Negative amortization mortgages worked for years before they became an economic disaster. Problem being a pragmatist is you can't be rational, because rationality demands a long-term perspective. You also can't have integrity, because integrity is acting consistent with principle. Hence so many ethical violations in business. You combine altruism with pragmatism, you get something I call the free lunch mentality. It's very interesting where people start in their discussions about dealing with the terrific economic problems the United States faces, and usually it's all about somebody else giving up something. Very few people want to objectively give up their free lunch. Unfortunately, too, the free lunch mentality leads to a lack of personal responsibility. And a lack of personal responsibility is ultimately the death of democracies. In fact, I would argue the central issue in our society today is personal responsibility. Are you responsible for yourself, or are you entitled to what somebody else produces? The Founding Fathers talked about the tyranny of the majority. And they were talking about the abuse of individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But they also recognized that when 51% of the people figured out they could vote a free lunch from 49%, pretty soon the party's up. Because then 60% want a free lunch from 40%, then 70% want a free lunch from 30%, and finally the 30% quit. Just like the cause of our financial problems are philosophical, so is our cure. And the cure was expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's fundamental moral right to their own life. Each individual's moral right to the pursuit of their personal happiness. Each individual's moral right to the product of their labor. If you produce a lot, you get a lot, including the right to give it away to whoever you want to on whatever terms you want to. And if you think about that moral prerogative, it demands personal responsibility, because there is no free lunch. It also demands and rewards rationality. It demands and rewards self-discipline. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, as libertarians, we're advocates of liberty. But interestingly enough, most people are advocates of liberty, of all kinds of political persuasions, because people use liberty in very loose terms. And a lot of times when people talk about liberty, it's kind of, well, I'd like to be free, and that's an interesting thing. But liberty is a lot more profound than that. It's a lot more profound because it has to do with man's fundamental nature. Everything that's alive has a method of staying alive. A lion has claws to hunt with, a deer has capacity to run from the hunter, and we have the capacity to think. And our capacity to think is literally our only means of survival, success, and happiness. And no shortcuts, there are no free lunches. In order to think productively, in order to sustain and promote our life, given our nature as human beings, we have to be free. Because we have to be able to pursue what we believe is right. If somebody tells you that 2 plus 2 is 5, and you have to act like 2 plus 2 is 5, you literally can't think. And that's what government rules and regulations do to business people. I personally experienced that. And if you think about it, all human progress, by definition, is based on creativity. Because unless somebody does something better, which will be different, there cannot be any progress. Creativity is only possible to an independent thinker. Somebody that thinks like the crowd cannot be innovative, cannot be creative, cannot contribute to human progress. That's why entrepreneurs are so important. They take the ideas of scientists and engineers and turn them into reality. It's why socialism and communism is doomed to failure, because it destroys innovation and destroys creativity. Very interesting historical fact. If you look at whenever Homo sapiens evolved, 250,000 BC, until 1750, human life expectancy basically was the same. And then in the 1750s, the late 1700s, there was a phenomenal invention. An invention equal to fire, equal to the wheel. And that invention was the idea of individual rights, of rule of law, limited government, of capitalism. It took a long time for capitalism to evolve, but capitalism is what changed life expectancy on this earth, more than most other material inventions. And what capitalism was about was people being able to pursue their own thought process consistent with our nature as human beings. So liberty isn't just nice, it is necessary for human well-being. How about the pursuit of happiness? You know, before Jefferson, before the thinkers of the Enlightenment, everybody existed for somebody else's good. Good of king, good of state, good of the church. Nobody existed for their own good. What Jefferson said is that each one of us has a moral right to pursue of our personal happiness. We're not guaranteed success in that pursuit, but we have that right. And if you think about that, that is actually a very selfish idea, isn't it? And it's important that we define selfish properly in that context. And I'll define it as acting in one's rational self-interest properly understood. And the reason for trying to define it that way is we get thrown a false alternative. This is kind of the false alternative we get in society. The false alternative is to take advantage of other people or to self-sacrifice, neither one of which make any sense. In fact, a lot of people think that taking advantage of other people is selfish. Here's the irony. Taking advantage of other people is not selfish, it's self-destructive. First place, nobody's going to trust you. You might fool Tom, Dick, and Harry, but they're going to tell Sue and Jane and Fred, and nobody's going to trust you. In addition, if you go around trying to manipulate other people's minds, you're going to do a lot more damage to yourself than you do to them. Taking advantage of other people is not selfish, it's self-destructive. How about self-sacrifice? That is the moral code in our society. And the moral code is that we should self-sacrifice. I want to ask you to ask yourself a profoundly important question. And for those of you that have children, make sure your children have the opportunity to ask themselves this question. Do you have as much right to your life as anybody else has to their life? Do you have as much right to your life as anybody else has to their life? Of course you do. Why would you believe anything different than that? So self-sacrifice and taking advantage of other people, neither one make any sense. But there is a proper moral code, and it's a rigorous, demanding code that underlies free societies and underlies free markets. And that code is that we're fundamentally traders. We trade value for value, and we get better together. In our business, we help our clients be economically successful and financially secured at BB&T when I was running BB&T, and we made a profit doing it. In fact, life is about creating win-win relationships. There are only two stable relationship conditions, win-win and lose-lose. Whenever we get greedy and we set up a win-lose, our partner gets bitter. You see this in spousal relationships, and we end up in a win-win, lose-lose relationship. Whenever we get self-sacrificial and we set up a lose-win relationship, we'll get better, and we end up in a lose-lose relationship. So in any meaningful relationship in your life, you should ask, what's in it for me? That's a fair question. But But you should also ask what's in it for them. Because if there's nothing in it for them, at the end of the day, there'll be nothing in it for you. And of course it's in your rational self-interest to help the people you care about, your family, your friends, people you work with. I happen to believe it's in my rational self-interest to support the United Way, which is an umbrella charity organization that does a lot of good in the community, and I wouldn't want to live in a kind of community that would exist if there was no United Way. So it's interesting to think about what the demands are for acting in your rational self-interest. It would require that you have a sense of purpose, that you take care of your mind, that you take care of your body, that you work hard to create healthy human relationships, and you do that all within the context of the kind of world you'd like to be in. You kind of ask yourself, what kind of world would I enjoy doing, and what would I enjoy doing helping create that world? Just think if everybody acted in their self-interest in that regard. I would argue about 90% of the world's problems would go away. I don't think most people are selfish. I think most people are self-destructive. I had a brother-in-law who drank 24 beers a day, got cirrhosis of the liver, drank 24 beers a day, and he died. And people say, wow, he was selfish. No, he was self-destructive. Self-destructive. Jefferson had a profound insight in the pursuit of happiness. That is really what motivates human behavior and creates great outcomes in free societies. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Share with you my book. I have some economic projections, even though I don't believe economic projection is possible. But I'm going to give you some short-term projections and some long-term projections, which I do think are possible. We are probably in some kind of economic recovery, which is in some ways a good news, but in other ways I think it obscures a lot deeper problems. I think the most likely scenario, certainly not certain, is that we're going to have something that looks like the 1970s, which we call stagflation, where we have some real growth, but way below par real growth. Lower unemployment than today, but higher unemployment than we ought to have, and higher inflation over time. It's not a terrible time, but it's not a good time. What really petrifies me is what happens in the long term, in 20, 25 years down the road. We have a formula for economic disaster. If we continue with altruism, pragmatism, free lunch mentality, we face some really severe negative consequences. The unfunded liabilities under Social Security, Medicare, the new Obamacare program, the unfunded government pension plans are in excess of $100 trillion. That is a stunning number. We're running over $1 trillion annual operating deficits. We have a dysfunctional foreign policy. We have a really big problem with the retirement of the baby boomer generations, and all us old folks want to continue to be fed, and we've got a failed K-12 education system. It reminds me a lot of that story I talked about running the numbers for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, where it was mathematically certain they were going broke. That is exactly true for the United States. It is mathematically certain the United States goes broke unless we change direction. That's not politics, that's just a mathematical fact. Now, countries don't go broke the way businesses go broke. What they classically do is they hyperinflate and they pay their debts with funny money. So you get paid Social Security, but the money isn't worth anything. And they almost always, not always, but they almost always move towards statism, and statism reduces their standard of living even further. Argentina, in 1940, had a higher standard of living than the United States. Despite having vast natural resources, Argentina is a third world economy today. We're the next Argentina if we don't change directions. There is some positive signs. We still have time. These things go exponential in about 7 to 8 years. If we don't do something between now and 7 to 8 years, it becomes almost mathematically impossible to fix it without probably some form of social chaos that none of us will be excited about participating in. The question is, do we have the courage to fix it? I would use an analogy with medicine. We've been identified as having a form of cancer that is terminal, unless it is treated. The good news is it's treatable. However, the treatment is chemotherapy, and chemotherapy is not much fun. So the question is, are we willing to go through the chemotherapy to preserve the great strength and the long-term economic viability of the United States? You can get kind of pessimistic about that. Interestingly enough, and maybe surprising, I'm in the optimistic category. And the reason I'm optimistic is that I do think the United States has a unique and special sense of life. And I think Americans are highly innovative, highly entrepreneurial, and many Americans, hopefully a majority of Americans, are skeptical of big government. They want to live as free people. And that has ultimately been a great protection for our society. I'm going to close with one more thought targeted at groups like this. In addition to failures in economic policy and failures in philosophy, we also had lots of failures in leadership. Failures in leadership in government, lots of failures in leadership in business. And I want to talk about that because I think that's another part of the formula for our long-term success. Fortunately, my company, BB&T, did better through the financial crisis than any large institution in the United States, given our business. We were primarily a real estate lender, and we never had a single quarterly loss. And people ask me why. Well, we had some great people, we got some good strategies, but we really didn't have that much better people or that much better strategies than our competitors. What we had that was different was we have a very fundamental philosophy that we live rigorously in good times and in bad times. And we have 10 core values in that philosophy. And underlying those 10 core values are what I think are the three great virtues. The three great virtues: purpose, reason, and self-esteem. Purpose, reason, and self-esteem. As human beings, we are purpose-directed entities. We have to know where we're going in order to get there. Organizations, businesses, churches, civic organizations, universities are simply groups of human beings. For organizations to be successful, the people in the organization must vest in the purpose of the organization. At the individual level, something I find very discouraging is how many people, when I talk to them, describe their work as just some kind of burden. I gotta go to work. And if you think about all the time, effort, and energy you spend at work, wow, are you missing what life is about? By the way, this is not practice. This is it. This is your life. If you want to have passion and energy in your life, you have to have a sense of purpose in your work. And it's very interesting, while the content of purpose, I'm sure, will vary a lot by the people in this room, I would argue the context is the same for everybody here. And the context has two fundamental components. First component, I believe that every person in this room wants to make the world a better place to live. I don't think you'd be here tonight if you didn't want to make the world a better place to live. In fact, I think that's a characteristic of the vast majority of human beings. Not everybody, but the vast majority of human beings do want to make the world a better place to live. Now, it's very interesting. There are lots of ways you can make the world a better place to live. You don't have to go over to Africa and feed hungry children to make the world a better place to live. Businesses make the world a better place to live. We produce products and services that improve the quality of life. In fact, the primary difference between the quality of life in the United States and Africa is we have better businesses. Business is the act of production. And we, libertarians, are actually defenders of that production process. And by the way, before anybody can give something away, somebody has to produce it. And my life experience is producing it is a lot harder than giving it away. Business is noble work. Good doctors, good teachers, good homemakers, good scholars make the world a better place to live. There are lots of ways to make the world a better place to live, but you need to believe that your work is making the world a better place to live. The second component of purpose is equally important and far undiscussed. You need to make the world a better place to live doing something you want to do for you. You have a fundamental right to your own life. And if you were to make the world a better place to live but you didn't enjoy doing it, you will have wasted the most precious thing you have, which is you. And by the way, if you try to make the world a better place to live doing something you don't want to do, the odds are you won't do it very well. So you need to make the world a better place to live doing something you want to do for you. And that creates a sense of purpose. The means by which we accomplish our purpose is our capacity to think. We use the term reason. Human beings, we have a special means of survival, success, and happiness. That is our capacity to think rationally from the facts of reality. When I talked to the employees of BB&T, however, I said, that's not about IQ. I don't know how much you can change your IQ, and I know some very smart people that do some very destructive things. But there is a choice you can make about your thinking. And that choice is to commit yourself to be a master of whatever it is you choose to do. And if you look at people that have achieved mastery, they have very active minds, and they're committed to being lifelong learners. And they're particularly effective at learning from their life experiences. In fact, as human beings, we're primarily experiential learners. And if you look at people that are superior experiential learners, they do two simple but profound things well. Probably everybody in this room can associate with learning from your mistakes. You probably had mistakes that changed your life. However, unfortunately, a lot of times we don't learn from our mistakes, so we embed them in our personality, and we get to do them over and over again. Why do we do that? In order to learn from a mistake, we have to avoid the ultimate psychological sin, which is the act of evasion. Evasion occurs when you're presented with some piece of information that at some level you know needs to be examined. But you refuse to examine it because it threatens something you want to believe about the world or you want to believe about yourself, so you literally don't hear it. You know, I had the opportunity to know a lot of these CEOs, know a lot of them for a long time, of organizations that failed. You know, interesting characteristic, every one of them was very smart. Every one of them was well educated. Every one of them had been very successful in their field. You know what got them almost all in trouble? They evaded. There was information before them that they could have analyzed, but they didn't want to hear it because it would be painful to hear it. It would cause painful changes, and they didn't want to face it. Everybody that I know invades in some area of your life. Next time you hear something from your parents, spouses, friends, managers that you've heard before, you know ought to be examined, have the courage to examine it. The second thing that superior experiential learners do is recognize that life is a constant education if you choose to make it one. I had the opportunity when I was running BB&T to visit our community banks. We operate with 33 community banks, and I was fortunate to have lunches with our local advisory board members who were business community leaders. And I never had a boring lunch because they were always asking questions. They were always talking about going on. They were engaged. You can understand why they had been successful. They were in focus. Unfortunately, a lot of people live their lives out of focus. And when you're out of focus, you can't learn, you can't grow. Sometimes IQ gives people advantage, sometimes not. But one characteristic I find of successful people in all fields, they evade less and they stay in focus more, which is a huge competitive advantage in life. When you're clear about your purpose and you use your thinking capacity to accomplish your purpose, you get to do something really important. You get to raise your self-esteem. And self-esteem is the foundation for happiness, and happiness is the end of the game, right? And I mean happiness, not having a good time on Friday night, but happiness in the Aristotelian sense of a life well lived. Blood, sweat, and tears happiness. When you're 80 years old, you can look back and say, yeah, that was hard, and I'm glad I did it. Earned happiness based on achieving things that are valuable and important to you. Paid for with hard work, mental focus, effort, and energy. That's what the game is about, right? And as human beings, our goal is to pursue our personal happiness. And interesting enough, sometimes business people get confused. They think money's the end of the game. Nothing wrong with money. Money's a good thing. However, money is not an end. It can be a means to an end. It is not an end. Happiness is the end of the game. And the foundation for happiness is real self-esteem. And real self-esteem also has to be earned. A couple of thoughts about self-esteem. Self-esteem is fundamentally self-confidence in your ability to live and be successful given the facts of reality. Therefore, you earn your self-esteem by how you live your life. Nobody can give you self-esteem. You cannot give anybody self-esteem. You cannot give your children self-esteem. Live your life with integrity, raise your self-esteem. That's why self-esteem is so important. That's why integrity is so important. Another thought about self-esteem that actually has pretty big societal implications that we're in a discussion of in a profound way without really focusing on the issue. For everybody in this room, probably, and for the vast majority of people on this planet, the single biggest driver of self-esteem is your work. Because you spend a disproportionate amount of time, effort, and energy at work. That's what makes work important and drives your self-esteem. And I use work in the broadest context, raising children, very hard, very productive work. Whatever you define your work to be, it will drive your self-esteem. Something I said many times to the employees at BB&T. It's real important at BB&T that you do your job well, but it's far, far, far more important to you. Might fool me about how well you do your job, might fool your boss about how well you do your job, but you'll never fool you. And if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, given your level of skill, given your level of knowledge, you can't do anything possible. If you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Here's the good news, the flip's also true. Do your work the best you can do it. Given your level of skill, given your level of knowledge, you can't do the impossible, but do your work the best you can possibly do it, and you will raise your self-esteem. Which is more important than whether you get a promotion or more money, because it's about your character. It's about who you are. And that idea actually has very profound social implications. Very profound social implications in regards to what we as libertarians believe. Take a construction worker, bricklayer, has a really tough, hard, grinding job. My granddad had that kind of job. Real tough, hard, grinding job. But somehow he and his wife raised their children successfully. Maybe his granddaughter becomes CEO of a publicly traded company, maybe not. He has a hard, tough life, but he gets something really precious from his work. He gets to be proud of himself. he gets to have self-esteem. Take that same bricklayer and give him welfare. He may be better off financially, but he loses something incredibly important. He loses his pride. He loses his self-esteem. You know, there's a lot of discussion in our society today about security, and Americans care about security, but this is not the land of security. People didn't get on a boat and come to Jamestown to be secure. The United States is the land of opportunity. Opportunity to be great, opportunity to fail and try again. But most importantly, the opportunity of that bricklayer to live life on his own terms, to pursue his personal happiness, given his beliefs, his values, to live as a free and independent man. And that is the American sense of life, which is what made the United States great. It is why people keep coming to the United States. It is our great source of strength. It is very precious to protect, and that's really why I wrote my book. Thank you very much. All right, questions? We've got a lot of them.
Just a second. Thank you, John. We will bring microphones around, so John will call on people, but please don't talk until the microphone gets there. And let me just point out that the one thing I forgot to say in the introduction was, we're here to talk about John's new book, The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure. And we have copies out there for you to buy and get them signed, and we also have copies that you can buy on our website or at any good bookstore in America. Now, let's take some questions.
All right, I'll start up here in the front.
Sure. Ramon Buehler with a group called the Madison Coalition. And my question is, you've watched the American political process now for many years. Do you think that the Congress of the United States and the President are capable of the long-term fiscal discipline that the country requires? Or do you think there might need to be some kind of constitutional discipline, either imposed by Congress or perhaps even imposed by the states?
That's a great question. Here's a little context. I believe, unfortunately, that we get the politicians we deserve. It is the ideas that matter. That's why I talk so much about ideas. And the biggest issue is changing the ideas, restoring the ideas that made America great in the first place. If we could do that, now we got to take back the public school system and get a private school system, then we could change the game. In the interim, I think we're primarily buying time. I think three things that would help in terms of what you call structure. One, I do think, and I've had mixed emotions over the years, but I really think we need term limits. I think we've turned too many politicians into professional politicians, and that's unhealthy. I would vote for a constitutional amendment that has some kind of restriction on government spending. I know it's not perfect, and they'll cheat, but at least it's progress. But I think a third thing is way underestimated, as I think we need to force the Federal Reserve to go to a gold standard. And the reason for that, if you can print money, as the Federal Reserve is doing right now, and politicians of both parties, no matter how much they squall, are buying votes with that money, it's the temptation to leverage is huge. When the Federal Reserve was created, the United States had no debt, basically. We'd gone through the Civil War, which was 100 times more dramatic for the United States in World War II, and the country had paid off its debt without a central bank, without a Federal Reserve. And now we have this incredible debt, and it couldn't have been facilitated if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve. So I think a gold standard, I'm for private banking, but a minimum of a gold standard that is from the Federal Reserve. In fact, I would actually put that number one on the list, because it really would make Congress hard, make it hard for Congress to borrow. Let me get one question. Phones are down here. I'll call here and then I'll go back.
Hi, Lisa Miller, Tea Party WDC. My question is, if we did convert to a gold standard, then we would have to necessarily immediately cut spending. And we have an example of that with Harding and Coolidge, and within 18 months, the private sector had recovered all the jobs lost from crony capitalism and government spending. I guess my question is wouldn't that not force the states to reform their education system? It would force them to change their constitutions to means tested only, fully portable, and maybe even devolve it down to the local level and or to the private sector entirely.
I don't know. I don't know what all the ripple through effects of the gold standard would be, but I think they would be big. Because it would really immediately impose this from government. And that's why I think it's the number one step. It doesn't cure all our problems, because they can cheat around even gold standards. But the history of economic well-being is very correlated when the reserve currency of the world, the United States dollars, the reserve currency of the world, is tied to something that can't be manipulated by politicians. Traditionally been gold or silver, but when politicians can manipulate the standard of value, they cheat a lot. So, and when you can't cheat, then it does force discipline and makes you do more rational things. Let me get in the middle. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Diane Katz with the Heritage Foundation. Given that the primary causes of the financial crisis were government policy, and the supposed remedy, Dodd-Frank, is even more bad government policy, I don't know how do we get out of that?
That's a great question. You know, Romney has said, that I don't know what that means, that he would repeal Dodd-Frank. And if you want to restore economic growth in the United States, that is obviously one very necessary action. We have put balls and chains on the financial industry in the United States, and if you don't have a healthy banking system, you can't have a healthy economic economy. That's why people get so excited about banks. And the regulatory cost in the banking system has gone off the chart. I was just at a BB&T board meeting yesterday, and it's unbelievable how much the regulatory burden has gone. And there's basically been practically no innovation in the banking industry since Dodd-Frank was created. It's destroyed innovation. We were the world's leader in financial services. It was a huge job creator. It was a huge competitive advantage. We misinterpreted the problem, put balls and chains on the people that were carrying the ball up the hill, and we got the real negative consequences. But we got to repeal Obamacare. We got to repeal Dodd-Frank to begin the process. But I tell you, this regulatory tack, and I talk to lots of business people. Even though I'm running a think tank, my history is business, and BB&T was mostly a small business lender. This regulatory attack is as broad as it's ever been because we don't have rule of law in the United States. It's important to understand that. We have rule of regulators. Congress passes all these sound good laws. They're not supposed to be able to do this constitutionally, but that's what they do. And the regulators decide what the law is. And they have this huge range. And it depends on who's leading. If you have a more free market president, they don't enforce the regulations. But if you have a very anti-free market president, basically the law changes. For example, right now, the lending standards for small business in the United States are the tightest they've been in my 40-year career. And that's because the regulators don't want to get in trouble. They don't want any banks to get in trouble, so they've literally tightened the lending standards across the whole spectrum. And it's much harder for a small business to get a loan than it ever has been in 40 years in the